In this video, I'm going to show how you can authorize a payment for a marketplace payment upfront, but not actually capture the payment until a later date. You'll see here we're hiring this freelancer for 5 hours of work for a total cost of $400. This is going to be split between the platform and also the freelancer. I'm going to fill out these payment details really quickly. And what we'll see is when this payment is processed, it's going to be split between the platform and also the freelancer. So if we go in here to our Stripe dashboard and just refresh the payment section, you'll see here that payment for $400 has gone through, but it's uncaptured. And then what we can do is we can trigger that payment once it's been delivered. So this is the freelancer payment here that we want to activate. So I'm going to click on that pay button. You'll see the payment status just changed from requires capture to succeeded. And when we go into our Stripe dashboard and refresh that, you'll see the status payment has now changed. And when we go to collected fees, what we'll see is 20% of that, which is $80, has just gone to the platform, which is our services marketplace. I want to show you the database setup very quickly just before we go into building out the actual workflows. We have 3 data types, including the standard user data type. I've put on a number of fields here to allow for the user to sell services. You can see here we have an hourly rate, we have the name of the user, we have a profile photo, a role, which is going to be either a client or a freelancer. Again, I'm assuming that this is a kind of Fiverr or Upwork style marketplace where you have both types of users. We have seller account ID, which is important because this is the Stripe account ID of the freelancer who is selling their services. And then finally, we have service, which can be something like digital marketing, sales, or something like that. We have another data type called job, where we're defining the client who is a user, the freelancer who is the user. We're marking it as complete using a yes or no field once it is complete. We're looking at the total cost of the job, and then we're also linking it to a transaction. And if we look at transaction here, you'll see we have a number of different fields. We'll go through them in a minute. I built this freelancer page here, which we can take a look at. If we go back to our digital marketing freelancer, it's quite simple. It's pulling in the data for that user, and we're using its hourly rate, we're using the name, and then we're clicking on hire to actually trigger the Stripe checkout session. To actually implement this, I'm using the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin. It's a paid plugin that I have developed myself. You can add it by going to Add Plugins, searching for Stripe Connect Marketplace. I've created a number of tutorials showing how to configure this plugin, so I'm not going to go into that now, but you can look at the links in the description for videos like that. What I really want to show is this workflow here. When button hire is clicked, what we're actually doing. And we're doing a number of things. First of all, we're creating a new transaction, but we're leaving that blank. I'll come back to that in a second. Then we're creating a new job and we're filling out all these fields here. The client is going to be the current user because that's the person who is purchasing the service. The freelancer is a current page user. Now, that does look a bit confusing, the fact that there's 2 different user fields. What I'm doing here is I'm setting the data type on the freelancer page to user, and then when I click on a freelancer on the home page, we're sending that user's page to the data, and that's how it's showing up here. By default, I'm saying complete as being no because the job is not complete. And then for cost, I'm taking the value in this field here, which is 5 at the moment, and multiplying that by the hourly rate of the freelancer. And then finally, I'm attaching the transaction I created in step 1, adding it to step 2. This is a really important workflow, and I'm actually going to recreate it from scratch. We'll recreate the whole rest of this workflow from scratch. Once you install the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin, you're going to have a bunch of actions. The one we're going to want for this particular use case is Stripe Connect create checkout session. There's a number of fields here that we want to fill out, and I'm going to do so now. Success URL is going to be where the user is directed to after they successfully completed the payment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send them to this website home URL, which is going to send us to the home page. And then at the end of that, I'm going to put in dashboard because that's where I want to send the customer so they can just get an overview of all the jobs they currently have open. For cancel URL, I'm going to put in one more thing. I'm going to put in website home URL, and instead of putting in the dashboard, I'm actually just going to leave it at the home page. Stripe account ID. So this is really important. This is the Stripe account ID of the freelancer who is selling a service. And you do need to onboard users in order for them to get the Stripe account ID. I have a couple of other tutorials on how to do that, so I'm not going to go into it here, but I will put links below. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in current page users, which is going to be our freelancer, and I'm going to put in their seller account ID just to show you how that looks in the database. If we look at all users and we look at our Brandon Jones, who is the user we bought something off in the intro, you'll see here the seller account ID, that is a Stripe ID. Going back to our workflow, platform fee in cents. So it's important to note that Stripe always takes in values in cents rather than in dollars or whatever currency you may be looking at using. So what I'm going to do is, you might remember in our database here, for example, the hourly rates you can see are in dollar terms. So we're going to need to multiply that by 100. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say current page users, hourly rate, multiply that by 100 to get us to the cents we need. Then I'm going to multiply it by the number of hours that they're going to be doing. So I'm going to go and find that input, number of hours, its value. So at the moment, we're taking the $80 per hour, we're multiplying it by 5. But now remember, this is the platform fee in cents. This isn't the total value of the transaction. And I'd like my services marketplace to take a 20% cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply it again. I'm going to multiply it by 0.2. And then for the total price in cents, what we can do is exactly the same thing. So we're going to copy that, but we're just not going to have the multiply by 20% at the end. Quantity here is only going to be 1. And then currency, we're going to leave it in US dollars. You can pick whatever currency you like as long as it conforms with the criteria that I set out here in the descriptions. Product name. So what we're going to do is we're going to say current page users service. And then we're going to put in a dash and say the number of hours that we're doing it for. So we'll do input number of hours and its value. And then at the end of that, we'll just put in hours. So what we should get here is, let's say, digital marketing, 5 hours. On behalf of, this is quite an important field. If this is set to no, then the platform is going to be the merchant of record for this transaction. But what's important here is that if we do that, and the platform and the connected accounts are based in separate geographic kind of payment regions, you will not be able to settle that transaction. So if our platform is US based, for example, and our connected account of the merchant, the seller of the services, was based in Europe, that would not work. In my case, I can set yes here because my platform is Irish based and my seller of the service is Brandon. He is also Irish based. But take a read of this. There's some really good information as well at the link in the instruction. And then this is really important here. So authorize only. If we set this to no, that means the payment is going to go through fully once we pay for it in the Stripe checkout session. If we set it to yes, this means that we're only going to authorize the payment now, but it will not go through until we trigger so at a later date. Now, it is really important to know that you can only do this for 7 days. So you authorize the payment, it doesn't go through until you trigger it, but if after 7 days you have not triggered the payment, it will just be cancelled. This is an optional field. I'm going to leave that blank for now. So we've created our Stripe checkout session. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make changes to the transaction that we created in step 1. And we're going to fill out a few fields here. First thing we're going to fill out is the amount. And that's really easy. We can use the result of step 3, amount. Then we're going to say checkout session ID equals a result of step 3, checkout session ID. This is going to be really important for saving down data associated with the transaction later on. Next, we're going to look at the seller account ID, and that's quite simple again. We're going to go with current page users, seller account ID. So that's going to be linked to Brandon seller account ID, which we already looked at here. And then finally, we have a very easy step. All we need to do next is we need to open an external website, and the website we're going to is result of step 3, its URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete the existing transactions in the database so we can see from scratch how it's going to look. And then I'm going to refresh that page. And this time, let's hire Brandon for 10 hours. And click on the hire button. So we've seen a payment for $800 come through. And what I'm going to do is just quickly fill out these details. And let's pay for this now. So we should see this $800 charge come through on our Stripe dashboard. So let's go to all payments and refresh that. In fact, we don't even need to. You can see here it's uncaptured $800 payment. If we go to collected fees, you'll see the $160, which we should see because it's 20% of 800. That hasn't come through yet because, again, we haven't actually captured this payment yet. So let's go back to our dashboard. And I can see here we have a number of different rows, and I realized what I forgot to do is just delete the existing jobs to make it a bit clearer. So I'm just going to delete the old ones, delete them. We now have this one job, and you'll see here the payment status field is blank. And the reason for that is we haven't actually updated the payment intent ID or the payment intent status for this transaction. What that value there is, and we can just go to our dashboard, we can see it. You'll see that this table, it's searching for jobs, and it's only putting in jobs where the client equals to the current user. But this particular field here, the payment status, is the current row's job transactions payment intent status. So again, going back to our database, we have transaction as a field in job, and then in transaction itself, we have this payment intent status. And in the job we just created, which is linked to this transaction, you'll see we don't have any payment intent ID and we don't have any payment intent status. So we need to fix that first before we actually capture the payment. And the reason we haven't done that yet is we haven't saved down some of the data associated with the transaction. And we're going to need to go back to our freelancer page and make some small changes to this success URL here. What we're going to do is we're going to put in some URL parameters, and what these effectively are is they're information that we can send to the page and then use that information to save down data. The way you use these is you start off with putting in a question mark, and then I'm going to create a parameter called transaction. And then the question is, how do we identify the transaction that we're creating? Well, the simplest thing to do, I think, is to use the unique ID of the transaction we've just created in step 1. So I'm going to go to insert dynamic data and go to, as a result of step 1, its unique ID. I'm also going to put this in on the cancel page because I think it's good practice to update your payment status even if it doesn't go through. So again, I'm going to say transaction equals get result of step 1, unique ID. So this is good because we're going to be able to send a URL parameter up here to identify the transaction, but we need to do some more work in order to save down the right data. So I'm going to go back to our dashboard page, and I'm going to delete the workflow that's here just so we can recreate it. I'll delete that one as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say when page is loaded, I'm going to make changes to a thing, and I'm going to try and find the transaction that I'm sending to the dashboard page. So I'm going to do a search for the transaction, and then I need to figure out how to identify that transaction. What we'll see in a second is we're going to have a kind of URL parameter up here that says transaction equals, and then a bunch of characters for unique ID. I'm going to use this unique ID to find the transaction in my database I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say unique ID equals get data from page URL. Parameter name is going to be transaction, and that will help us identify it. Because there's only going to be one transaction in our database with that unique ID, I can put in first item here, and that's what we want to change. So where we want to get to is update this payment status field, which is the payment intent status. But to get that, we need to do something first. We need to say payment intent ID equals get data from an external API, and then we're going to go to Stripe Connect, retrieve checkout session details. Checkout session ID, which is this field here, is going to be equal to this transaction's checkout session ID. And that's why that was so important to save down earlier. This helps us identify the right checkout session to get the payment intent ID from. There's a bunch of fields you can actually use here. We're going to go back up and we're going to go to payment intent. So that's the payment intent, and then we need to add one more step here, and it's going to be make changes to a thing. Again, we're going to be changing the transaction in step 1, and this time we're going to be adding the payment intent status. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to once again go to get data from an external API, but this time we're going to use the Stripe Connect get payment details call. And the reason we're breaking this down into two separate workflows is you'll see here you actually need the payment intent ID we're getting in step 1 to get the payment intent status that we're getting in step 2. So I'm going to put in this transaction's payment intent ID, and then we can go down here to the end and get status. Now, at the moment, this is going to run every time we load the page, but sometimes we might just want to go to the dashboard. So let's say we're on the home page and we want to go to the dashboard. We don't really need this workflow to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to run it when get data from a page URL, when transaction is not empty. So when there's something in transactions, we're going to run it, otherwise we're not. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete the existing transaction and the existing job in our database and recreate it from scratch. So we'll refresh that. So you can see no transactions in our database at the moment. We're going to hire our digital marketing whiz Brandon one more time. This time we're only going to do it for 4 hours, so $320. So we'll hire him. Once again, I'll put these payment details in very quickly, and let's pay for that digital marketing 4 hours of work. Okay, so now you can see we're redirected to the dashboard page. And the first thing I want to bring your attention to is this transaction parameter in the URL. This is the unique ID of the transaction that we've just created. You can see here it ends in 9,000. And if we go into our database and look at transactions, look at the unique ID, you'll see here it ends in 9,000. So that's how that works. And then because we have this in the URL, we're updating the payment intent ID, which we can see in the transactions, which in turn is updating the payment intent status. And we can see at the moment that this requires capture. And we can also see this in our dashboard. If we refresh our payments tab, you'll see here, the most recent payment of $320, it's uncaptured. So let's say we have a bit of back and forth with Brandon, our freelancer, and we're happy with his work and we want to pay him. We're going to need to do this within 7 days, because again, this will expire after 7 days. But what we can do is we can build a workflow here that will pay Brandon, the platform will get their cut, and then we're also going to update the status. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my dashboard and I'm going to add a workflow to this pay button here. What I'm going to say is I'm going to go down to element actions. I'm going to go down to plugins and I'm going to say Stripe Connect capture a payment. And what we need to put in here is the payment intent ID of the payment that we are capturing. I've built a table element, so you can see here we have current rows job, which is effectively this job here. And then this is the transaction associated with the job. So I can say transactions, payment intent ID. So that's going to capture the payment, but we want to make sure this works. So what we're going to do is we're going to update this payment status just to make sure that it has gone through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to make changes to a thing. The thing we're changing is the current rows jobs transaction. And we're changing the payment intent status to equal get data from an external API, get payment details. Again, we're going to use the payment intent ID associated with this transaction. And I'm going to go for status again. So very similar to what we've already done on page load. And then finally, what I want to do is if this changes to a certain value and that value is succeeded, that's what's going to happen if we do indeed capture the payment. I want the job complete to update from no to yes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make changes to a thing. I'm going to make changes to the current rows job. I'm going to say complete is yes. And I made a bit of an error there because we should be doing that further down. Current rows job, and now we're saying complete is yes. But we're only going to run this workflow when current rows jobs, transactions, payment intent status, which is what we are changing here, is succeeded. So it's only going to run if the status that comes back from this is succeeded. So let's refresh our page, and hopefully now when I click pay, we're going to see the payment status change from requires capture to succeeded. The job complete is going to change from no to yes, and in our dashboard we're going to see this go through. Let's see if that works. Okay, that looks promising. You can see your job complete has gone to yes, payment status has gone to succeeded. And if we refresh our Stripe dashboard, you can see here it has succeeded, and we should see 20% of this go to the platform. And indeed, that's coming through there. So that's how you authorize payment details at one point in time, capture them at a later stage. If you have any questions, you can let me know in the comments.